On the evening of February 3, 1998, inside Texas's Huntsville unit, Karla Faye Tucker lay strapped to a gurney. At exactly 6:45 p.m., the state of Texas carried out her execution by lethal injection. She was 38 years old, the first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War, and only the second in America since the death penalty's reinstatement. She had been only 23 when she committed the brutal double murder that brought her to this moment, spending 15 long years on death row. The irony was staggering. Tucker had become a born-again Christian, an articulate advocate for redemption whose spiritual transformation had convinced world leaders to plead for her life. She had seemed to embody the possibility of human change. A drug-addicted killer who found God behind bars and dedicated her remaining years to helping others. Yet her pursuit of drugs and revenge had driven her to commit murders so brutal that hardened police officers were haunted for years. As the lethal chemicals flowed through her veins, Tucker praised Jesus Christ, licked her lips, and hummed softly. Her journey from troubled child to death row convert had taken 38 years. A descent that began with childhood abuse, progressed through prostitution and drug addiction, and climaxed with pickaxe murders that shocked a nation. But Tucker was not alone in her fall from grace. Daniel Ryan Garrett had shared her fate as a killer, each carrying their own catalog of horrors that brought them to a Houston apartment on June 13, 1983. Together, they would orchestrate a double murder so savage that it would become one of the most notorious crimes in Texas history. A brutal ending to two innocent lives, and the beginning of a 15-year legal battle that would captivate the world. Jerry Lynn Dean, the hard-working mechanic, a man whose only crime was trusting the wrong person with keys to his apartment, his traditional values and mechanical skills had built a modest but honest life, restoring motorcycles and helping friends. His estranged wife's dangerous associations would transform his home into a slaughterhouse. Deborah Ruth Thornton, the innocent bystander, a 32-year-old woman whose marital problems led her to seek companionship for a single night. Her trust in basic human decency would place her in the path of violence so extreme that even her killers would later struggle to explain it. Daniel Garrett, the calculating criminal, a career criminal whose methodical approach to theft and drug dealing had kept him free for decades. His experience with violence was clinical and controlled, but his partnership with Tucker would unleash chaos that even he couldn't manage. Karla Faye Tucker, the lost child, a young woman whose childhood had been stolen by drugs, prostitution, and abuse before she reached her teens. At just 23, her capacity for violence had been shaped by years of trauma, but the murders she would commit exceeded anything in her troubled past. 4 lives intersecting in the early morning hours of June 13, 1983. 2 would survive to face justice, transformation, and ultimately execution after 15 years of appeals and international controversy. 2 would die in ways so brutal that their murders would challenge everything society believed about redemption, mercy, and the possibility of human change. Their individual stories had been devastating enough, but together their stories would become something far more powerful than the sum of their parts. The execution had profound effects on some of the people who participated in it. Fred Allen, captain of the death house team that conducted executions, suffered an emotional breakdown within days of Tucker's death and resigned his position. Allen had supervised over 120 executions during his career, but Tucker's case broke him in ways that decades of state-sanctioned killing had not. Allen later explained that Tucker's execution had been different from the others he had supervised because of her peaceful acceptance of death. Her composure during the process had shaken his confidence in capital punishment. "I was pro-capital punishment," he would later say. After Karla Faye and after all this, until this day, 11 years later, no sir. He gave up his pension and changed his life, rather than continue participating in a system he could no longer support. But to understand how a 23-year-old drug-addicted prostitute became an international symbol of redemption, how a routine burglary became a bloodbath that shocked experienced homicide investigators, why her religious conversion sparked a worldwide campaign for mercy during her 15 years on death row. and how her execution shaped debates about justice and forgiveness for generations to come. We have to go back. Back to November 18, 1959. Back to a troubled Houston household. Back to the very beginning of Karla Faye Tucker's journey from innocent child to condemned killer to born-again Christian. In fact, we go back to the part of the case not always accessible to the media, the childhood that created a monster, and the transformation that made her human again. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. November 18, 1959, Houston, Texas. In a city hospital room, a baby girl took her first breath, unknowingly entering a world that would offer her little protection from the chaos about to engulf her family. Karla Faye Tucker arrived as the youngest of 3 sisters in a household already showing cracks that would soon become irreparable fractures. Her father, Larry Tucker, was a Houston longshoreman who worked the grueling shifts at the Gulf Coast shipping terminals. The port never slept, and neither did Larry, who often pulled double shifts, loading and unloading cargo ships to support his growing family. His calloused hands and weathered face told the story of a man who understood hard work but struggled with the complexities of family life. What Karla didn't know during her earliest years was that Larry wasn't her biological father. She was the illegitimate daughter of a Houston firefighter of Greek ethnicity, a fact that would later explain her dark complexion and black hair that set her apart from her sisters. The Tucker household sat in a respectable middle-class Houston neighborhood where children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets and families gathered for weekend barbecues. Karla lived with her 2 older sisters, Kathy Lynn and Carrie Ann, in what appeared from the outside to be a typical American family pursuing the suburban dream. During Karla's earliest years, fragments of normalcy provided hope that childhood might unfold as it should. The family owned a bay house where they spent weekends water skiing and fishing in the warm Texas waters. Karla learned to drive both cars and motorboats at an unusually early age, showing the precocious independence that would later manifest in more dangerous ways. These golden moments at the bay house represented the closest thing to family stability that Karla would ever experience. She and her sisters would spend summer afternoons casting lines into the water, while their parents maintained the pretense of marital harmony. The photographs from this period show a little girl with bright eyes and genuine smiles, unaware that her world was about to collapse. But Carolyn Tucker harbored a restless spirit that domestic routine couldn't contain. She had become increasingly drawn to Houston's music scene, following rock bands across Texas with the dedication of a true groupie. The Allman Brothers, Marshall Tucker Band, and Eagles represented escape from suburban responsibilities that felt increasingly confining. Larry's demanding work schedule at the shipping terminals meant he was often absent during crucial family moments. The longshoreman's union work required his presence during unpredictable hours, sometimes keeping him away for 16-hour shifts when ships arrived unexpectedly. His absence created a vacuum that Carolyn filled with increasingly questionable activities. The marriage between Larry and Carolyn was troubled from its beginning, marked by fundamental incompatibilities that became more apparent as financial and emotional pressures mounted. Larry's practical, working-class values clashed with Carolyn's desire for excitement and adventure. Their arguments echoed through the house with increasing frequency as Karla reached school age. The girls learned early that their home operated by different rules than their neighbors. While other families maintained consistent bedtimes and homework schedules, the Tucker household shifted between periods of neglect and chaotic activity depending on their parents, relationship status, and Carolyn's latest musical obsessions. At age 8, Karla discovered her older sisters smoking cigarettes behind the house. Rather than reporting this discovery to their parents, she joined them, beginning a pattern of premature participation in adult behaviors that would define her childhood. Her sisters, already testing boundaries in a household where supervision was inconsistent, became her guides into increasingly dangerous territory. Carolyn's influence grew stronger as Larry's presence diminished due to work demands and marital discord. She began treating her daughters more like friends than children, sharing activities and information that should have remained in the adult world. When she caught Carla smoking marijuana poorly, instead of punishment, Carolyn provided instruction on rolling better joints, treating drug use as a normal part of growing up. The divorce proceedings began when Carla was 10 years old, but the legal battles revealed secrets that shattered whatever remained of her sense of family security. During these contentious hearings, Carolyn revealed that Carla was not Larry's biological daughter, but the result of an extramarital affair with the Greek firefighter. This revelation destroyed any remaining foundation of trust and belonging in Carla's young life. Learning that the man she had called father was not related to her, while simultaneously watching her parents' marriage disintegrate, left her emotionally adrift at the most vulnerable stage of her development. The custody arrangements reflected the chaos of the adults' lives and their inability to prioritize their children's needs over their own conflicts. Initially placed with Larry, who despite his limitations had provided whatever structure existed in her early life, the girls eventually gravitated toward their mother's more permissive but dangerous lifestyle. As Carla's 10th birthday approached, her childhood was ending in ways that went far beyond normal adolescent development. The foundation of love, safety, and unconditional acceptance that healthy families provide had crumbled completely. In its place stood confusion, abandonment, and premature independence that would shape every decision she made going forward. The little girl who had once enjoyed family fishing trips and weekend adventures was learning that survival meant adapting to chaos rather than seeking the stability that other children took for granted. The transformation from innocent child to dangerous adult had already begun, though the most devastating chapters of her story still lay ahead. The custody battle, however, ended with Larry Tucker gaining legal control of his 3 daughters, but legal documents couldn't repair the damage already done. His small Houston home became a way station rather than a refuge for children who had already learned that adults couldn't be trusted to maintain consistency. Larry's work schedule remained brutal. The shipping industry demanded his presence during unpredictable hours, leaving the girls unsupervised for long stretches. He loved his daughters but lacked the skills to address their emotional needs or behavioral problems. His solution was to provide material things while hoping their issues would resolve themselves. Carla tested every boundary Larry attempted to establish. At 10 years old, she was already smoking marijuana regularly, a habit her sisters had normalized. When Larry discovered evidence of drug use, his responses were inconsistent and ineffective. He would lecture and threaten punishments, but rarely followed through, especially when work called him away. The girls recognized their father's limitations and exploited them. They stayed out past curfew, skipped school, and brought questionable friends to the house. Larry's attempts at discipline felt hollow when he disappeared for 12-hour shifts immediately afterward. Within months, the living arrangement collapsed. Larry admitted defeat and allowed the girls to return to their mother's house. This decision marked the end of any pretense of traditional family structure in Carla's life. Carolyn Tucker's home operated by an entirely different set of rules. She had embraced her role as a rock groupie with increasing commitment, following bands across state lines and bringing her daughters along for the adventure. What seemed like maternal bonding was actually exposure to adult situations that would accelerate Carla's path toward trouble. At Carolyn's house, drug use wasn't hidden or discouraged. Instead, it became a shared activity between mother and daughters. Carolyn criticized Carla's technique when she caught her smoking marijuana poorly, then provided instruction on rolling better joints. This wasn't parental guidance, but participation in behavior that was destroying her daughter's development. The house attracted a rotating cast of musicians, dealers, and hangers-on from Houston's music scene. These adults treated the Tucker girls as peers rather than children, offering them drugs, and involving them in conversations about topics far beyond their maturity level. School became irrelevant in this environment. Carla's attendance dropped dramatically as traveling with bands took priority over education. Teachers noticed her absence and declining performance, but no effective intervention occurred. The system failed to recognize that a 10-year-old girl was slipping through every safety net. By age 11, Carla had progressed from marijuana to harder substances. Her first experience with heroin came through her sisters, connections in the music scene. The adults around her treated this escalation as inevitable rather than catastrophic. Carolyn's parenting philosophy centered on preparation for what she saw as life's harsh realities. Rather than protecting her daughters from danger, she exposed them to it under the guise of education. This approach robbed Carla of any chance to develop healthy coping mechanisms or self-protection instincts. The progression from marijuana to heroin happened rapidly once access became available. Carla's developing brain couldn't process the consequences of addiction, and the adults in her life either couldn't or wouldn't intervene. By her 12th birthday, she was using needles regularly. Sexual activity began around the same time as the harder drug use. The music scene exposed her to adult relationships and expectations that she was emotionally unprepared to handle. What should have been years of gradual social development compressed into premature sexual experiences with lasting psychological impact. As Carla entered her teens, the transformation from troubled child to dangerous adult was already well underway. At 14, Carla officially dropped out of school. No truancy officers pursued her case effectively, and her academic records simply stopped. Education had become irrelevant in a world where survival skills mattered more than traditional learning. The mother-daughter team traveled extensively, following bands like the Allman Brothers, Marshall Tucker Band, and Eagles across the American South. These tours provided steady income through prostitution, while exposing Carla to geographic areas where her age and circumstances made her virtually invisible to authorities. At 16, Carla briefly married Stephen Griffith, a mechanic she met during one of the band's tours. Griffith was 19 and thought he was rescuing a troubled teenager from bad circumstances. He provided her with a Harley-Davidson motorcycle and steady income from his seasonal work, believing these material improvements would solve her problems. The marriage offered a glimpse of conventional life, but Carla lacked the emotional tools to sustain it. She had never learned to form healthy relationships or manage conflict constructively. The domestic routine felt foreign after years of constant travel and excitement. Griffith genuinely cared for his young wife and appreciated her adventurous spirit, but he couldn't compete with the pull of her established lifestyle. The marriage lasted several years, but Carla continued using drugs and maintaining connections to the music scene that had shaped her adolescence. During this period, she met Shawn Dean, a woman who would inadvertently connect her to the victims of her future crimes. Shawn was married to Jerry Lynn Dean, and their troubled relationship would eventually provide the motivation for the violence that followed. Through Shawn, Carla was introduced to Daniel Ryan Garrett, a man 14 years her senior who worked on the edges of Houston's criminal underworld. Daniel Ryan Garrett entered the world in the rough neighborhoods of Houston, where survival meant adapting to violence early. Unlike Carla's middle-class origins, Garrett grew up understanding that criminal activity wasn't rebellion, but necessity in communities where legitimate opportunities remained scarce. His childhood unfolded in the post-war boom years when Houston's economy was expanding rapidly, but the benefits of this growth didn't reach every neighborhood equally. Garrett's family struggled with poverty, addiction, and the kind of generational dysfunction that produces career criminals rather than occasional offenders. By his teens, Garrett was already known to local police for petty theft, drug possession, and assault charges. These early encounters with law enforcement taught him to be careful rather than lawful. He learned to avoid getting caught rather than avoid breaking the law. The 1960s counterculture movement provided cover for Garrett's criminal activities. Drug dealing became more acceptable and profitable as marijuana and psychedelics gained popularity among middle-class youth. Garrett positioned himself as a supplier to college students and young professionals who wanted drugs but lacked direct access to criminal networks. His physical presence intimidated most people who met him. At over 6 feet tall with a muscular build developed through manual labor, Garrett could enforce his business decisions through violence when necessary. This reputation allowed him to operate in dangerous situations that would have destroyed smaller or weaker dealers. By the 1970s, Garrett had expanded beyond drug dealing into burglary, robbery, and fencing stolen goods. He developed a network of associates who could handle different aspects of criminal enterprises, from planning to execution to disposal of evidence. His role became coordination rather than direct participation in the most dangerous activities. The introduction to Carla came through his connection to Sean Dean, whose marriage to Jerry Lynn Dean was deteriorating rapidly. Garrett saw opportunity in the domestic conflict, both for criminal enterprise and personal relationships. Carla's youth and willingness to take risks made her valuable for operations that required someone capable of gaining trust quickly. Garrett's criminal philosophy centered on avoiding unnecessary violence while maintaining credibility through demonstrated willingness to use force when challenged. He preferred theft and drug dealing to robbery because they involved less direct confrontation with victims who might identify him later. The relationship with Carla developed gradually as he recognized her potential value as both criminal partner and sexual companion. Her experience with prostitution meant she could handle situations that would overwhelm most women her age. Her drug addiction made her dependent on his supply connections. Unlike Carla's chaotic family background, Garrett came from a criminal environment where violence was calculated rather than emotional. His approach to crime involved planning, risk assessment, and clear understanding of potential consequences. This methodology would break down catastrophically during the events of June 1983. As June 1983 approached, Garrett was planning what he expected to be a routine burglary, motivated by both profit and personal revenge against Jerry Dean. The target wasn't chosen randomly. Dean represented both opportunity and personal satisfaction for the criminals who were about to destroy his life. Garrett had no intention of committing murder, but his criminal experience hadn't prepared him for the explosive violence that Carla was capable of unleashing. To understand why Jerry Dean became the focal point of this deadly plan, and how an ordinary working man became entangled with Houston's criminal underworld, we must examine the life and times of a man whose only crime was trusting the wrong person. Jerry Lynn Dean was born in 1956 into a working-class Houston family that valued hard work and personal responsibility. His parents raised him with traditional values that emphasized earning what you received and treating others with basic respect. These principles would guide him through life until the night they couldn't protect him. Dean's early years were marked by mechanical aptitude and fascination with motorcycles. He could disassemble and rebuild engines before many of his peers learned to drive cars. This talent became both hobby and profession as he developed skills that provided steady employment in Houston's expanding industrial economy. During high school, Dean was known as a reliable friend who avoided serious trouble while maintaining relationships with students from various social groups. He wasn't academically exceptional, but his practical intelligence and willingness to help others made him popular among classmates and teachers alike. After graduation, Dean found work in Houston's construction and manufacturing sectors, where his mechanical skills were valued and well compensated. He saved money systematically and invested in tools and equipment that would allow him to eventually start his own repair business. The motorcycle restoration work began as a weekend hobby, but gradually expanded into a profitable side business. Dean's apartment became a workshop where he could complete projects that friends and acquaintances commissioned. His reputation for quality work and fair pricing brought steady customers. Dean's personal life centered on relationships with friends who shared his interests in motorcycles and mechanical projects. He enjoyed the camaraderie of working on machines while talking about sports, politics, and local events. These friendships provided stability in an otherwise solitary lifestyle. The relationship with Sean began promisingly, but deteriorated as her personal problems became apparent. Sean struggled with drug use and attracted friends whose criminal activities created problems for Dean. He tried to help her overcome these issues but gradually realized that his efforts were ineffective. The marriage to Sean was both an attempt at stability and mistake in judgment. Dean believed that marriage would provide motivation for Sean to abandon her dangerous lifestyle, but the legal commitment only made him more entangled in her problems rather than solving them. Sean's friendship with Carla Tucker brought criminal elements directly into Dean's life. He recognized Carla as dangerous and tried to limit her access to his home, but Sean's loyalty to her friend created ongoing conflict between the married couple. The tension escalated when Dean discovered that Sean had given Carla keys to their apartment. This violation of trust represented more than inconvenience. It was a security breach that made Dean vulnerable to people he considered threats. His demands that Sean retrieve the keys and limit contact with Carla led to arguments that hastened their separation. By early 1983, Dean and Sean were living separately while pursuing divorce proceedings. Dean kept the apartment where he conducted his motorcycle restoration business, while Sean moved in with friends from the music and drug scene that had caused their marital problems. The separation should have provided Dean with the safety and stability he sought, but Sean's failure to retrieve the apartment keys left him vulnerable to exactly the kind of violence he had tried to avoid. His trust in his estranged wife's basic decency would prove fatal. On June 12, 1983, Dean attended a party where he met Deborah Thornton, a woman who seemed to offer the kind of stable relationship he had hoped to find with Sean. Deborah Ruth Thornton was 32 years old when her life intersected fatally with the chaos surrounding Jerry Dean's failing marriage. She represented everything that Jerry had hoped to find in a partner: stability, maturity, and distance from the criminal elements that had destroyed his relationship with Sean. Born into a middle-class family, Deborah had experienced the kind of conventional upbringing that provided emotional security and clear expectations about adult behavior. Her parents emphasized education, personal responsibility, and making careful choices about relationships and career paths. Deborah's marriage to Richard Thornton appeared successful from the outside, but like many relationships, it contained private tensions that weren't visible to friends and family. She and Richard had built a comfortable life together, but emotional distance had developed over time, leading to arguments and periods of separation. The fight with Richard on June 12, 1983, was typical of the conflicts that had been occurring with increasing frequency in their marriage. What made this argument different was Deborah's decision to leave the house and attend a party where she hoped to clear her head and gain perspective on her domestic problems. Deborah's presence at the party was motivated by need for social interaction rather than desire to meet someone new. She wasn't seeking romantic adventure, but rather the kind of friendly conversation that might help her process her marital difficulties and decide how to proceed. The connection with Jerry Dean developed naturally throughout the evening. Both were dealing with relationship problems, and their conversation provided mutual support and understanding. Jerry's mechanical knowledge and Deborah's practical approach to problem-solving created an easy rapport between them. As the party wound down, Jerry invited Deborah to see his motorcycle restoration work at his apartment. For Deborah, this represented innocent interest in his hobby rather than romantic proposition. She was curious about his craftsmanship and appreciated his obvious pride in his work. The decision to spend the night at Jerry's apartment was spontaneous rather than planned. Their conversation had been enjoyable, and Deborah wasn't ready to return home to continue the argument with Richard. Jerry's apartment offered neutral ground where she could think about her situation without pressure. Deborah had no knowledge of the criminal elements connected to Jerry's estranged wife or the danger that Sean's association with Carla Tucker represented. From her perspective, Jerry was a hard-working man dealing with divorce proceedings, not someone whose life intersected with drug dealers and violent criminals. As Deborah slept peacefully next to Jerry in the early morning hours of June 13, 1983, she had no way of knowing that drug-addicted criminals were planning to enter the apartment where she felt safe. While she rested in what should have been a secure space just miles away, two people were descending into a drug-fueled madness that would transform them from petty criminals into brutal murderers. Carla Tucker and Daniel Garrett had been using drugs for 3 consecutive days at Tucker's residence on McKean Street, a binge that started as weekend recreation but extended into dangerous territory as their inhibitions dissolved and their judgment deteriorated beyond any semblance of rational thought. What had begun as typical party behavior for their social circle had evolved into a pharmaceutical nightmare that would have deadly consequences. The combination of substances they had consumed was staggering in its variety and potentially lethal in its interactions. Along with marijuana and alcohol, they had ingested heroin, Valium, speed, Percodan, Mandrax, Dilaudid, methadone, tequila, and rum. This chemical cocktail represented everything they could obtain through Garrett's criminal connections and Tucker's prostitution earnings. The drug combination created psychological effects that neither fully understood or could control. The stimulants produced manic energy and grandiose thinking, while the depressants created emotional numbness and reduced inhibitions. The alcohol amplified all these effects while impairing their already compromised decision-making abilities. Tucker, who had been using drugs since childhood, had never experienced anything quite like this extended binge. Her normal capacity for violence and impulsive behavior was magnified exponentially by the chemical chaos in her system. Every emotion was amplified, every grievance seemed urgent, and every violent impulse felt justified. Garrett's criminal experience had taught him to avoid situations where drug use might compromise his judgment during illegal activities. However, his relationship with Tucker had introduced variables into his life that his methodical approach to crime couldn't manage. Her influence was drawing him into exactly the kind of reckless behavior he had always avoided. The drug cocktail produced the kind of manic energy that demanded action, but completely impaired their ability to assess consequences. Tucker and Garrett found themselves unable to sleep or relax, constantly seeking stimulation that would match their artificially elevated mental state. Their conversations jumped erratically between topics without logical connection, and their proposed activities escalated from reckless to genuinely dangerous. James Lebrant, a friend who had been participating in portions of the extended drug session, watched with growing concern as Tucker and Garrett's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. Their speech patterns were disjointed, their attention spans virtually non-existent, and their decision-making processes completely compromised by the chemical warfare occurring in their brains. Lebrant had his own history with drugs and crime, but he recognized that his friends were entering territory that even he found alarming. The discussion of Jerry Dean began as routine complaint about past grievances, but evolved into concrete planning for direct action against someone Tucker viewed as an enemy. Her resentment toward Dean centered on multiple incidents where he had damaged her property, treated her disrespectfully, and interfered with her friendship with his wife Shawn. Tucker's anger toward Dean had been building for months, fueled by his attempts to limit her access to Shawn and his obvious disapproval of her lifestyle. She viewed him as an obstacle to her friendship and a source of conflict in her already chaotic life. The drugs had transformed these simmering resentments into urgent demands for action. The specific incident that had crystallized Tucker's hatred occurred when Dean had punched her in the face while she was wearing glasses, sending her to the hospital to have glass fragments removed from her eye. This assault had created both physical injury and psychological humiliation that she had never forgotten or forgiven. Garrett's interest in targeting Dean was more practical than emotional, reflecting his criminal experience and calculating nature. He knew that Dean kept valuable tools and motorcycle parts in his apartment. items that could be sold quickly for cash to fund additional drug purchases and criminal activities. The burglary represented business opportunity rather than personal revenge. Dean's apartment also contained television equipment, stereo systems, and other electronics that had good resale value in Houston's thriving black market. Garrett had learned through previous criminal activities which items were most profitable and easiest to move through his network of fences and dealers. The decision to act on their plans was influenced by their knowledge that Dean lived alone in an apartment that Tucker could access using keys that Sean had lost and Tucker had found. The combination of opportunity, motive, and severely impaired judgment created conditions that made violence almost inevitable. Tucker had been carrying Dean's apartment keys for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity to use them for revenge or profit. She had mentioned this access to Garrett multiple times during their relationship, and he had filed the information away for potential future use. The planning session revealed how dramatically drugs had distorted their thinking processes. What should have been careful consideration of risks and benefits became an excited discussion of how to accomplish their goals without any regard for potential consequences. They failed to consider basic questions about timing, evidence, potential witnesses, or the possibility that their simple burglary might escalate into something far more serious. Their conversation was recorded in fragments by neighbors, who later reported hearing loud, agitated voices discussing violence and theft. The drug-fueled planning session continued for hours as they became increasingly excited about their proposed criminal activity. Tucker's role in the planning was particularly disturbing, as she advocated for violence beyond what was necessary for a simple burglary. She had talked repeatedly about offing Dean and taking his motorcycle, language that suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous criminal activity. Leibrandt's participation was reluctant, but influenced by the group dynamics and his own impaired mental state. He agreed to accompany them, but planned to remain outside during the actual burglary, a decision that would make him a crucial witness to events that spiraled completely beyond anyone's control. The weapons were gathered casually rather than with deliberate intent to commit violence. Garrett brought along his shotgun as insurance against resistance from Dean or unexpected visitors. He also gathered rubber gloves, though whether he actually wore them during the crime would later become a point of controversy. The drive to Dean's apartment occurred during the early morning hours, when police patrols were minimal and potential witnesses were asleep. The timing provided tactical advantages that they had stumbled into rather than planned systematically, but it also meant that their victims would have no hope of rescue once the violence began. At Dean's apartment complex, they found the quiet environment they expected. Most residents were asleep, the parking areas were deserted, and the conditions seemed perfect for a quick burglary that would provide cash and satisfy Tucker's desire for revenge against someone she hated. The apartment complex was typical of Houston's working-class housing, practical, affordable buildings that housed people who valued steady employment over luxury amenities. The design provided multiple entry and exit routes, but it also meant that sounds could carry between units if the violence became too loud. As they approached Dean's door, Tucker retrieved the keys that Sean had lost and she had found months earlier. The ease of access seemed to confirm that their plan was sound and that success was virtually guaranteed. They had no way of knowing that Dean was not alone, or that their entry would trigger events that would destroy multiple lives forever. 3 a.m., June 13, 1983. The key turned silently in Jerry Dean's apartment door as Carla Tucker and Daniel Garrett stepped into the darkness that would forever change their lives and end two others. James Leibrandt remained outside, watching for police or witnesses, unaware that his friends were about to cross a line from which there could be no return. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft sounds of sleeping occupants. Jerry Dean lay in his bedroom, exhausted from the party and peaceful in the company of Deborah Thornton, whom he had met just hours earlier. Neither had any reason to expect danger in what should have been a safe, private space. Carla moved through the apartment with confidence born from previous visits during her friendship with Sean. She knew the layout and the location of Jerry's tools and motorcycle parts. What she didn't know was that Jerry was not alone, or that her presence would wake him. The plan unraveled immediately when Jerry stirred and recognized Carla's voice. The element of surprise was lost, and the burglary became a confrontation between people who already disliked each other. Jerry's attempts to assert control over his own apartment triggered violent responses from intruders whose judgment was completely impaired. Garrett struck first, using a ball-peen hammer he found on the floor to hit Jerry repeatedly in the back of the head. The blows were intended to subdue rather than kill, but head injuries are unpredictable, and Jerry's resistance continued despite the trauma he was receiving. Carla found a pickaxe among Jerry's tools and joined the attack with enthusiasm that shocked even Garrett. Her strikes were not calculated attempts to disable, but expressions of rage that had been building for months. The drugs amplified her anger into homicidal fury that couldn't be controlled or redirected. Jerry's pleas for mercy only seemed to increase Carla's violent excitement. Later testimony would reveal that she experienced sexual arousal with each blow of the pickaxe, a psychological response that demonstrated the complete breakdown of normal human empathy and impulse control. The attack continued long after Jerry stopped moving. Carla delivered 28 separate pickaxe blows to his head and body, continuing to strike, even when it was obvious that further violence served no purpose except her own gratification. The overkill revealed a level of psychological disturbance that went far beyond drug-induced impairment. Deborah Thornton's presence was discovered only after Jerry was dead. She had hidden under bed covers against the wall, hoping that the intruders would take what they wanted and leave without noticing her. Her attempt at invisibility failed when the lights revealed her location. The decision to kill Deborah was made quickly and with little discussion. As a witness to Jerry's murder, she represented a threat to their freedom that they believed could only be eliminated through additional violence. The logic was criminal rather than rational, but it drove their next actions. Deborah's death was even more brutal than Jerry's. Carla struck her repeatedly with the pickaxe, finally leaving the tool embedded in her chest as a grotesque signature of the violence that had consumed the apartment. The scene was so devastating that experienced police officers would be haunted by it for years. The physical evidence left behind was overwhelming. Blood, fingerprints, and DNA connected the killers to the scene in ways that would be impossible to explain away. Their drug-impaired state had prevented them from taking even basic precautions to avoid detection. The stolen items were almost an afterthought in the aftermath of the bloodbath they had created. They loaded Jerry's motorcycle parts and some tools into his El Camino truck, but the value of these items was insignificant compared to the legal consequences they now faced. The burglary that was supposed to provide quick cash had instead created capital murder charges that would eventually send them both to death row. As they left the apartment in the early morning darkness, Carla and Garrett crossed an invisible line from the world of petty criminality into the realm of death row inmates. The apartment behind them contained evidence that would eventually convict them both of capital murder, but in their drug-addled state, they believed they had committed the perfect crime. The El Camino was abandoned later that morning in a parking lot near the Astrodome, where it would sit unnoticed for days while police began their investigation. The motorcycle parts were transferred to other locations, distributed among Garrett's criminal associates who had no idea they were handling evidence from a double homicide. By sunrise on June 13, 1983, Carla and Garrett had returned to their normal routines, confident that their crime would never be discovered. They had no way of knowing that Jerry Dean's reliability and work ethic would lead to the discovery of their victims within hours of the murders. Gregory Travers stood on the sidewalk outside Jerry Dean's apartment complex, checking his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. Jerry was never late for work, and their construction project couldn't afford delays. Something was definitely wrong. Traver had known Jerry for 2 years through their job at a Houston construction company, where they worked as partners on commercial building projects throughout the city. Jerry's reliability was legendary among their coworkers. He arrived early, worked hard, and never left his partner waiting without explanation. This unexplained absence was completely out of character for someone who took professional commitments seriously. The construction crew was scheduled to begin work on a downtown office building at 7 a.m. And Jerry's absence meant that Traver couldn't access the equipment and materials that were stored in Jerry's truck. The delay would cost them money and potentially jeopardize their relationship with the general contractor who had hired them. The walk to Jerry's apartment took less than 5 minutes from where Traver had been waiting in the company truck. The building was typical of Houston's working-class housing, practical, affordable, and home to people who valued steady employment over luxury amenities. Jerry's unit was on the ground floor for easy access to his motorcycle workshop and the tools he needed for both his construction work and restoration business. Traver had visited the apartment several times during their partnership, usually to pick up tools or discuss upcoming projects. He knew that Jerry kept expensive equipment there and was always careful about security. The fact that Jerry might have overslept seemed impossible for someone who was naturally disciplined and responsible. The front door stood slightly open when Traver approached, another detail that didn't match Jerry's careful habits about home security. He was meticulous about locking his door, especially when expensive tools and motorcycle parts were stored inside. Jerry had mentioned concerns about break-ins in the neighborhood and always took precautions to protect his property. Traver called Jerry's name through the partially open door, but received no response from the silent apartment. The lack of response was disturbing, but he couldn't immediately determine whether Jerry was inside and unable to answer or had left without properly securing his home. The decision to enter the apartment wasn't made lightly. Traver understood that he was potentially trespassing, but his concern for Jerry's welfare and their professional obligations overcame his respect for privacy. He pushed the door open slowly and called Jerry's name again before stepping inside. The interior showed signs of disturbance that immediately alarmed Traver and confirmed his worst fears. Boxes of materials were stacked in unusual locations, and valuable items had been moved from their normal positions. The television and stereo equipment sat ready for transport rather than use, suggesting that someone had been preparing to steal Jerry's possessions. The motorcycle Jerry had been restoring was missing from its prominent place in the living room. This Harley-Davidson represented months of painstaking work and significant financial investment. Its absence confirmed Traver's growing fear that Jerry had been the victim of crime, but he still hoped that his friend might have survived whatever had occurred. Moving deeper into the apartment, Traver noticed dark stains on the walls and floor that his construction experience told him were blood. The quantity and distribution suggested violence rather than accident, and the patterns indicated that serious injuries had been inflicted in multiple locations throughout the apartment. The metallic smell of blood mixed with other odors that Traver couldn't immediately identify created an atmosphere of death that made his stomach clench with dread. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to No Way Out. Here, we uncover real cases of crime, punishment, and the people who reach the point of no return. By breaking these stories down piece by piece, we give you the full picture so you can decide what justice really means. Don't forget to hit the like button, share this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case. The 911 call was made from Jerry's telephone while Traver tried to avoid disturbing what was obviously a crime scene. His construction background had taught him to be careful around dangerous situations, and this apartment clearly contained evidence that police would need to examine in its original state. 911, what's your emergency? I need police and ambulance at 2818 McKean Street, apartment 6. I found my friend. There's been a murder. 2 people are dead. Traver's voice remained steady despite the horror he had witnessed. his work experience having taught him to function under pressure. He provided clear directions to the apartment and answered the dispatcher's questions while avoiding any unnecessary movement through the crime scene. Houston Police Department patrol officers arrived within minutes of Travers' call, their sirens cutting through the early morning quiet of the working-class neighborhood. Their initial assessment confirmed that 2 people were dead and that the scene showed signs of extreme violence that would require specialized investigation. The patrol officers secured the perimeter and called for homicide detectives, recognizing immediately that this was far beyond a routine death investigation. The apparent brutality of the crimes and the evidence of burglary created a complex scene that would require experienced investigators. Detective J.C. Mosier had investigated over 300 homicides during his career with the Houston Police Department, but the Dean Thornton crime scene presented unusual challenges that would test his experience and investigative skills. The extreme violence suggested personal motivation, but the apparent burglary motive complicated the picture. The forensic evidence was abundant but required careful analysis to be useful. Fingerprints found throughout the apartment needed to be compared against databases of known criminals, a process that could take weeks in 1983. Blood evidence had to be tested for type and other characteristics that might identify the perpetrators. The pickaxe left in Deborah Thornton's chest provided the most dramatic evidence, but also the most frustrating. The weapon belonged to Jerry Dean and came from tools stored in his apartment, meaning it couldn't directly identify the killers. However, fingerprints on the handle might provide crucial identification. Interviews with Jerry's friends and family revealed the troubled marriage to Sean and her association with questionable people. Sean's drug use and connection to Houston's music scene provided investigators with their first potential leads toward identifying suspects. The missing keys became a central focus of the investigation. Jerry had complained to friends about Sean giving apartment keys to people he considered dangerous. If these keys had been used to gain entry, the burglary was actually committed by someone with legitimate access to the apartment. Sean Dean's interview was conducted carefully, as she was potentially both witness and suspect. Her emotional response to the news of Jerry's death appeared genuine, but her drug use and lifestyle made her statements unreliable. More importantly, her association with dangerous people made her a potential link to the actual killers. The neighborhood canvass produced few useful leads initially. Most residents had been asleep during the early morning hours when the crime occurred, and the apartment complex's design limited visibility between units. However, some neighbors remembered seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the parking area during recent weeks. The stolen El Camino was found abandoned near the Astrodome within days of the crime. Forensic examination revealed fingerprints and other evidence that didn't match Jerry or Deborah, providing investigators with their first physical evidence directly connected to the perpetrators. James Liebrandt's name surfaced during interviews with people connected to Sean's social circle. His reputation as someone who associated with criminals made him a person of interest, but initial attempts to locate him for questioning were unsuccessful. The drug angle became more prominent as investigators learned about the extent of substance abuse among Sean's friends. The extreme violence of the crime suggested that the perpetrators might have been under the influence of stimulants that could cause paranoid and aggressive behavior. Weeks passed without arrests, and the case began to attract media attention as an example of random violence that threatened ordinary citizens. The fact that Deborah Thornton had been an innocent bystander who happened to be in the wrong place made the crime particularly frightening to the public. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source involving family members of both killers. Doug Garrett, Daniel's brother, contacted Detective Mosier with information about conversations he had overheard. His decision to become an informant was motivated by fear that his brother's criminal activities were escalating beyond control. The situation became even more complex when Doug's girlfriend, Carrie Burrell, revealed that she was Carla Faye Tucker's sister. This meant that Kari had direct access to information about Carla's involvement in violent activities, while Doug had inside knowledge of his brother Daniel's criminal behavior. The family connections between the informants and the suspects made their information incredibly credible and provided investigators with specific names and details about the crime. Both informants had intimate knowledge of the killer's behavior, habits, and conversations that no outside witness could have obtained. The decision to use Doug Garrett as a wired informant was risky but necessary. Both his brother Daniel and Carla trusted him completely, making it possible to record conversations that might provide evidence of their guilt. The recordings would become crucial elements of the prosecution's case. The investigation was entering its most dangerous phase, as the suspects remained free while evidence was being gathered against them. The challenge was to complete the case without alerting them to the fact that they were under surveillance. Doug Garrett's decision to cooperate with police required immense courage, as he was essentially betraying his own brother to prevent future violence. The recording equipment had to be concealed carefully to avoid detection during conversations with people who were naturally suspicious of surveillance. The first recorded conversation took place at Carla and Daniel's shared residence on McKean Street. Doug arrived on his motorcycle, appearing casual and friendly, while the hidden microphone captured every word spoken during the next 90 minutes. Carla's description of the murders was detailed and enthusiastic, revealing the pleasure she had experienced during the violent acts. Her account of achieving orgasm with each pickaxe blow provided prosecutors with evidence of her psychological state during the crime and her lack of remorse afterward. Daniel Garrett's admissions were more calculating, focusing on the practical aspects of the burglary and the steps they had taken to avoid detection. His criminal experience showed in his concern about physical evidence and potential witnesses who might identify them. The recording captured Carla saying she had come with every stroke of the pickaxe, a statement so shocking that it would become central to the prosecution's argument about her dangerous character. The sexual gratification she derived from violence indicated psychological disturbance that made her a permanent threat to society. Additional conversations revealed details about the disposal of evidence and the division of stolen property. Jerry's wallet had been burned after removing the cash, and the motorcycle parts had been hidden in various locations around Houston. The quality of the recordings was excellent, making it impossible for defense attorneys to argue that the suspect's words had been misunderstood or taken out of context. The conversations provided clear evidence of guilt that would be devastating during trial. Carla's sister Carrie provided additional information about events before and after the murders. Her willingness to testify against her own sister demonstrated the family's recognition that Carla had become dangerous and needed to be stopped. The arrest warrants were obtained on July 20th, 1983, exactly 5 weeks after the murders. The delay had been necessary to build a strong case, but it also meant that 2 killers had been free to potentially commit additional crimes. Daniel Garrett was arrested at his home as he prepared to leave for work. His calm reaction to the arrest suggested that he had been expecting this development and had prepared mentally for the legal battle ahead. Carla Tucker's arrest occurred simultaneously at a different location. Her response was more emotional, but she quickly invoked her right to remain silent and requested an attorney. Her experience with the criminal justice system through her prostitution arrests had taught her to avoid making statements to police. James Leibrandt was arrested as an accomplice, though his level of participation in the actual murders was limited. His cooperation with prosecutors would be crucial in establishing the timeline of events and the planning that preceded the crime. The physical evidence collected during the investigation supported the recorded confessions perfectly. Fingerprints, blood evidence, and DNA testing confirmed that Carla and Daniel had been present at the crime scene during the murders. Media coverage of the arrests was extensive, partly because of the extreme nature of the violence and partly because one of the perpetrators was a young woman. Female killers were rare enough to attract special attention, especially when the crimes involved such brutal methods. The legal proceedings were about to begin, but the investigation had provided prosecutors with a strong case built on physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and recorded confessions. The challenge now was to convince a jury that the death penalty was appropriate for these crimes. Public reaction to the arrests was overwhelmingly supportive of law enforcement, but some observers noted the youth of the perpetrators and the role that drug abuse had played in the violence. The case would raise questions about the relationship between addiction and criminal responsibility. April 11, 1984. Harris County Courthouse, Houston, Texas. Carla Faye Tucker entered the courtroom to face a jury of 8 women and 4 men who would decide whether she lived or died. The composition of the jury was notable because female defendants in capital cases were extremely rare, and the jurors' gender might influence their perception of her culpability. Prosecutor Joe Magliolo opened the state's case with a methodical presentation of evidence that left no doubt about Tucker's guilt. The recorded confessions, physical evidence, and eyewitness testimony created an overwhelming case that the defense would struggle to counter effectively. The crime scene photographs were particularly devastating to Tucker's case. The images of Jerry Dean's battered head and Deborah Thornton's body with the pickaxe embedded in her chest demonstrated a level of violence that shocked even experienced court personnel. James Liebrandt's testimony provided crucial details about the planning and execution of the crimes. His account of Tucker's enthusiastic participation in the violence contradicted any suggestion that she had been a reluctant participant or victim of Daniel Garrett's influence. The recorded conversations were played multiple times during the trial, allowing jurors to hear Tucker's own words describing the sexual pleasure she had experienced while committing murder. Her voice expressing excitement about the violence was more damaging than any prosecutor's argument could have been. Tucker's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming, and her own statements had eliminated most potential defense strategies. Their only hope was to convince the jury that her youth and drug addiction made her less culpable than an older, sober defendant. The defense called a psychiatrist who testified about Tucker's drug history and mental state during the crimes. The expert witness described how prolonged substance abuse had impaired Tucker's judgment and impulse control, making her actions less deliberate than they appeared. Tucker took the stand in her own defense, a risky strategy that backfired when she appeared unremorseful and detached from the consequences of her actions. Her testimony revealed a self-centered personality that was more concerned with avoiding punishment than expressing genuine regret. The prosecution's cross-examination of Tucker was devastating. Prosecutor Magliolo systematically exposed the inconsistencies in her account and challenged her claims about being under the influence of drugs during the crimes. The jury deliberated for only 70 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on both murder charges. The speed of their decision indicated that the evidence had been overwhelming and that no serious doubt existed about Tucker's culpability. The punishment phase of the trial began immediately after the guilty verdicts were announced. This separate proceeding would determine whether Tucker received life imprisonment or the death penalty, requiring jurors to weigh aggravating factors against any mitigating circumstances. The prosecution presented evidence of Tucker's violent history and argued that she represented a continuing threat to society. Her previous assault on Jerry Dean, which had required him to seek medical treatment, demonstrated a pattern of violence that predated the murders. The defense presented testimony about Tucker's troubled childhood and drug addiction, hoping to convince jurors that these factors justified a sentence less than death. However, the extreme nature of the crimes made these mitigating factors seem inadequate. The jury's recommendation for the death penalty was unanimous, reflecting their conclusion that Tucker's crimes were so heinous that no lesser punishment would be appropriate. The formal sentencing by the judge was scheduled for several days later. Media coverage of the trial was extensive, with particular focus on Tucker's apparent lack of remorse and the sexual gratification she had derived from the violence. The pickaxe murderess became a household name throughout Texas and beyond. April 25, 1984. Judge Patricia Likos formally sentenced Carla Faye Tucker to death by lethal injection. The courtroom was packed with media representatives and family members of both victims and defendant as the historic sentence was pronounced. Tucker became the first woman sentenced to death in Texas since 1863, a fact that guaranteed continued media attention throughout her appeals process. Her youth and gender would make her case a symbol in debates about capital punishment for years to come. The Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, had housed female death row inmates since the resumption of capital punishment in 1976. But Carla Faye Tucker was only the second woman to arrive there. Her presence changed the dynamics of a facility designed primarily for male inmates facing execution. Tucker's cell was sparse and functional. A bed, toilet, sink, and small desk where she could write letters or read books. The isolation was intended to be punitive, but for someone whose life had been chaotic since childhood, the structure and routine provided unexpected stability. The first months on death row were marked by anger, denial, and attempts to blame others for her situation. Tucker initially maintained that Daniel Garrett had forced her to participate in the murders and that her drug use had made her actions involuntary. The prison ministry program offered religious services and counseling to inmates who requested them. Tucker initially participated out of boredom rather than genuine spiritual interest, but the consistent message of redemption and forgiveness gradually began to resonate with her. The Bible study sessions introduced Tucker to concepts of personal responsibility and moral transformation that had been absent from her previous life. For the first time, she was exposed to the idea that people could change fundamentally and that past actions didn't have to define future character. The religious conversion began slowly as Tucker started reading biblical texts in her cell during the long hours between scheduled activities. The stories of transformation and redemption spoke to someone who had never believed that change was possible for someone with her background. October 1983, just months after her arrival on death row, Tucker experienced what she later described as a spiritual awakening. Alone in her cell, she found herself on her knees asking God for forgiveness, a gesture that felt completely natural despite her lack of previous religious experience. The change in Tucker's behavior was immediately apparent to prison staff and other inmates. Her angry outbursts ceased, and she began participating in educational and counseling programs with genuine enthusiasm, rather than mere compliance with prison rules. Tucker's cellmate was Pam Perillo, another woman facing execution, whose sentence would eventually be commuted to life imprisonment. The two women developed a friendship based on their shared circumstances and Tucker's growing commitment to helping others find spiritual peace. The marriage to Reverend Dana Lane Brown 1995 was conducted by proxy, as Texas regulations prohibited contact visits for death row inmates. Brown had become Tucker's spiritual advisor and had witnessed her transformation from violent criminal to committed Christian advocate. Tucker's letters to family members and friends documented her spiritual journey and growing understanding of the harm she had caused. Her writing style evolved from self-serving complaints to thoughtful reflections on redemption and responsibility. The appeals process continued throughout Tucker's time on death row, but she gradually stopped participating actively in efforts to overturn her conviction. Her focus shifted from avoiding punishment to making positive contributions during whatever time she had remaining. Prison officials noted that Tucker had become a model inmate who helped maintain order and provided counseling to other women struggling with similar issues. Her influence was particularly strong among inmates dealing with drug addiction and family abandonment. The transformation was documented through hundreds of letters, recorded interviews, and testimony from people who had observed Tucker's behavior over many years. The evidence of change was overwhelming, but it raised difficult questions about the purpose of capital punishment. Tucker's case began attracting attention from religious leaders who argued that her spiritual transformation demonstrated the possibility of redemption even for the most violent criminals. This support would eventually grow into an international movement to spare her life. The question facing society was whether Tucker's transformation was genuine and whether it should affect her punishment. Her spiritual journey had made her a different person from the drug-addicted killer who had committed murder in 1983. But the legal system had to determine whether that change was relevant to her fate. By 1997, Karla Faye Tucker's case had evolved from a typical death penalty appeal into an international cause that attracted supporters from across the political and religious spectrum. Her religious conversion and articulate expressions of remorse had convinced many people that executing her would serve no legitimate purpose. Pat Robertson, founder of the Christian Coalition and longtime supporter of capital punishment, shocked his followers by publicly advocating for Tucker's clemency. His television program, The 700 Club, featured extensive coverage of her spiritual transformation and arguments that her execution would violate Christian principles of forgiveness. The involvement of Robertson legitimized Tucker's case among conservative Christians who normally supported the death penalty without exception. His willingness to oppose execution in this case suggested that spiritual transformation should be considered a mitigating factor in capital punishment decisions. Pope John Paul II personally appealed to Texas authorities for mercy, continuing his consistent opposition to capital punishment worldwide. The Vatican's involvement elevated Tucker's case to international significance and provided her supporters with moral authority that transcended national politics. The European Parliament passed a resolution requesting commutation of Tucker's sentence, reflecting European opposition to capital punishment and concern about American execution practices. This international pressure created diplomatic complications for American officials who preferred to treat death penalty cases as purely domestic matters. The most surprising supporter was Ronald Carlson, brother of victim Deborah Thornton. His religious conversion had led him to forgive Tucker and oppose her execution, creating a powerful symbol of redemption and reconciliation that challenged traditional notions of justice. Television interviews with Tucker demonstrated her intelligence and apparent sincerity, allowing viewers to see her as a person rather than merely a criminal. Her appearance on Larry King Live was particularly effective in humanizing her story and building sympathy for her situation. The clemency campaign generated thousands of letters to Governor George W. Bush and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. Supporters included ordinary citizens, religious leaders, celebrities, and politicians who believed that Tucker's transformation warranted mercy. Opposition to clemency came primarily from law enforcement officials and victims' rights advocates who argued that the severity of Tucker's crimes made her personal transformation irrelevant. They maintained that justice required execution regardless of subsequent behavior. Richard Thornton, Deborah's widower, remained adamantly opposed to clemency and actively campaigned for Tucker's execution. His presence at media events provided emotional weight to arguments that mercy would dishonor the victims and encourage other criminals. The debate raised fundamental questions about the purpose of capital punishment and whether the possibility of redemption should influence sentencing decisions. Tucker's case forced Americans to consider whether execution serves justice or merely satisfies desires for revenge. The international attention was embarrassing for Texas officials who preferred to handle death penalty cases without outside interference. However, the involvement of foreign governments and international organizations made Tucker's case a matter of diplomatic concern. Governor Bush faced enormous pressure from both sides of the debate. His political future depended partly on maintaining his tough-on-crime image, but the religious and international opposition to Tucker's execution created risks to his broader political ambitions. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles would make the initial decision about clemency, but Governor Bush retained the authority to grant a 30-day reprieve if he chose to do so. The political calculations surrounding these decisions would prove crucial to Tucker's fate. January 28, 1998. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles faced one of the most high-profile clemency decisions in the state's history. The 18-member board had rarely recommended mercy for death row inmates, but Karla Faye Tucker's case presented unusual circumstances that demanded careful consideration. The board members had reviewed thousands of pages of documentation about Tucker's crimes, her religious conversion, and the International Campaign for Mercy. Their decision would influence not only Tucker's fate, but also the future of capital punishment debates in Texas and beyond. Chairman Victor Rodriguez announced the board's unanimous decision to reject all of Tucker's clemency requests. The vote was 16-0 against commutation, with 2 members abstaining. The decisive margin reflected the board's conclusion that Tucker's crimes were too severe to justify mercy. Rodriguez explained that the board had focused primarily on the heinous nature of Tucker's crimes rather than her subsequent behavior. The brutal murders of 2 innocent people created a debt to society that could only be paid through execution, regardless of personal transformation. The decision meant that Governor George W. Bush was Tucker's last hope for avoiding execution. His authority was limited to granting a 30-day reprieve, but such action would signal that he believed Tucker deserved additional consideration. Bush faced intense pressure from multiple directions. Religious leaders urged him to show mercy as an expression of Christian values, while law enforcement officials and victims' rights advocates demanded that he allow the execution to proceed as scheduled. The political implications were significant for Bush, who was expected to seek the Republican presidential nomination in 2000. His handling of Tucker's case would be scrutinized by national audiences who would judge his leadership abilities and moral character. Bush had established clear criteria for clemency decisions, asking only 2 questions. Was there any doubt about the defendant's guilt? Did the defendant receive fair legal representation and due process? Tucker's case met neither standard for commutation. The governor's office received thousands of calls and letters from around the world, with supporters of clemency slightly outnumbering those demanding execution. However, Bush's advisors noted that most Texas voters supported the death penalty and expected their governor to enforce it consistently. February 2, 1998. Governor Bush announced his decision to deny Tucker's request for a 30-day reprieve. In a prepared statement, he acknowledged the difficulty of the decision, but explained that the legal system had provided Tucker with all the protections to which she was entitled. Bush emphasized that questions about Tucker's spiritual transformation were best left to a higher authority, rather than government officials. His statement attempted to show respect for religious concerns while maintaining his commitment to enforcing the law. Tucker's attorneys filed last-minute appeals challenging the Texas clemency process as unconstitutional, but federal courts declined to intervene in state death penalty procedures. The legal system had exhausted all possibilities for preventing the execution. As February 3rd drew to a close, Tucker prepared for her final hours while supporters maintained vigils outside the Huntsville prison. The international attention had made her execution a symbol of American justice that would be remembered long after her death. February 3rd, 1998, 6 a.m. Karla Faye Tucker woke in her cell at the Huntsville unit for the last time, knowing that barring a miracle, she would be dead before midnight. The certainty of her fate brought a strange peace after 14 years of appeals and uncertainty. Tucker had spent the previous night writing letters to friends and family members, expressing gratitude for their support and asking forgiveness for the pain her crimes had caused. Her handwriting remained steady despite the emotional weight of these final communications. The breakfast was simple: toast, coffee, and fruit that she barely touched. Her appetite had disappeared as the execution approached, but she maintained the composure that had characterized her behavior throughout the appeals process. Reverend Dana Lane Brown, her husband by proxy marriage, arrived for their final visit. Their conversation focused on spiritual matters, and Tucker's confidence that death would bring her face to face with the God she had found during her transformation on death row. Tucker's sister Carrie was among the family members who came to say goodbye. The visit was emotional but not chaotic, as Tucker's spiritual growth had brought peace to relationships that had been damaged by years of criminal behavior and drug addiction. The media attention was unprecedented for a Texas execution. Hundreds of reporters from around the world had gathered in Huntsville to cover the death of the woman who had become a symbol in debates about redemption and capital punishment. Protesters filled the area outside the prison, with death penalty opponents holding vigils, while execution supporters demanded justice for Tucker's victims. The divide in public opinion was visible in the competing demonstrations that continued throughout the day. Tucker's final meal request was modest: a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. She ate very little, spending most of the afternoon in prayer and reflection rather than consuming food that no longer interested her. The legal appeals continued until the final hours, but each court that considered Tucker's case declined to intervene. The U.S. Supreme Court's final denial came at 5:30 p.m., eliminating Tucker's last hope for judicial relief. Governor Bush confirmed his refusal to grant a reprieve in a brief statement released at 6 p.m. His decision cleared the final obstacle to Tucker's execution and triggered the procedures that would end her life within the hour. Tucker was moved to the holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber at 6:15 p.m. The small room contained only a cot and basic facilities, providing a sterile environment for the final preparations. The witnesses began arriving at 6:20 p.m., including family members of both victims and Tucker, prison officials, media representatives, and spiritual advisors. Each person had been carefully screened and briefed on the procedures they would observe. Tucker's final statement was prepared but brief. She had decided to focus on expressing remorse for her crimes and gratitude for the love she had received rather than making arguments about her transformation or the justice of her execution. At 6:30 p.m., Tucker was escorted to the execution chamber, where she would spend her final minutes strapped to a gurney while lethal chemicals ended her life. Her composure remained steady as she faced the culmination of a legal process that had lasted nearly 15 years. The execution chamber was small and clinical, designed to make the process as efficient and humane as possible. Tucker was placed on the gurney and secured with leather straps, while IV lines were inserted into her arms. The witnesses watched through a window as Tucker spoke her final words, expressing sorrow for the pain she had caused and love for the people who had supported her. Her voice remained clear and strong as she prepared to die. At 6:37 p.m., the lethal injection began. The 3-drug combination was designed to render Tucker unconscious before stopping her heart, providing a death that was supposed to be peaceful and painless. As the deadly chemicals began flowing through her veins, Tucker praised Jesus Christ, demonstrating her unwavering faith even in her final moments. She licked her lips and looked toward the ceiling, humming softly as the drugs took effect. Her composure was remarkable, showing none of the fear or distress that often characterized executions. Within 2 minutes, Tucker gave 2 deep sighs and then a groan as the chemicals continued their work. Despite the solemnity of the moment, her peaceful demeanor reflected the spiritual transformation that had defined her final years on death row. At 6:45 p.m., exactly 8 minutes after the injection began, Tucker was pronounced dead. Her eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling as if looking toward the heaven she believed awaited her. The witnesses who observed her final moments would later describe her remarkable calmness and continued expressions of faith until the very end. The execution proceeded exactly as the state had planned, but Tucker's peaceful acceptance and religious devotion during the process would leave lasting impressions on everyone present, including prison officials who had conducted many executions but had never witnessed such serene composure from a condemned prisoner. The news of Karla Faye Tucker's death spread instantly around the world, carried by satellite feeds and internet reports to audiences who had followed her case for months. The execution marked the end of the most publicized death penalty case in decades. Outside the Huntsville prison, the crowd of protesters reacted with mixed emotions. Death penalty supporters cheered and sang "Na na 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 na, say goodbye," while execution opponents wept and prayed for Tucker's soul and the victims of the criminal justice system. Richard Thornton, widower of victim Deborah Thornton, told reporters that justice had finally been served. "This day belongs to Deborah Ruth Thornton," he said. "Her killer has been sent to a place we're all going to go to sometime, some place my wife already is." International reaction was swift and critical. European newspapers condemned the execution as evidence of American barbarism, while human rights organizations used Tucker's death to argue against capital punishment worldwide. Pat Robertson expressed disappointment with Governor Bush's decision, stating that the execution represented vengeance rather than justice. His criticism carried weight among conservative Christians who had supported Tucker's clemency appeal. Pope John Paul II issued a statement expressing regret that Texas had proceeded with the execution despite international appeals for mercy. The Vatican's involvement had elevated Tucker's case to a matter of global significance. The execution had profound effects on some of the people who participated in it. Fred Allen, captain of the Death House team that conducted executions, suffered an emotional breakdown within days of Tucker's death and resigned his position. Allen later explained that Tucker's execution had been different from the others he had supervised because of her obvious spiritual transformation and peaceful acceptance of death. Her composure during the process had shaken his confidence in capital punishment. Prison officials noted that Tucker's death had affected other death row inmates, many of whom had looked to her as an example of the possibility for redemption. Her execution sent a message that transformation might be irrelevant to ultimate punishment. The victims' families expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, but they also acknowledged the difficulty of living through years of media attention and legal proceedings. The execution provided closure that had been delayed by the lengthy appeals process. Tucker's body was transported to Houston for burial at Forest Park Lawndale Cemetery, where a small group of supporters held a memorial service. The ceremony was private, attended only by family members and close friends who had witnessed her transformation. Within a week of the execution, normal operations had resumed at the Huntsville prison, where other death row inmates awaited their own dates with the executioner. Tucker's cell was cleaned and prepared for the next female defendant sentenced to death. If you found this case thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. Here, we break down real cases bit by bit so you can form your own conclusions. Hit the like button, share this story with others, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Was justice served, or was an opportunity for mercy lost? Real cases, real consequences. This is No Way Out.